This story is a work of dark historical horror fiction, inspired by folklore and whispered legends from the Appalachian Mountains. While certain elements of geography, culture, and history may be based on real aspects of the Appalachian region, the people, family, and events described here are entirely fictionalized. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The purpose of this narrative is not to defame or misrepresent Appalachian heritage, but rather to explore the unsettling themes of cruelty, secrecy, and generational horror through a fictional family dynasty. Due to the disturbing nature of the story, depicting violence, psychological torment, and macabre practices, this tale is not recommended for sensitive audiences. Listener and reader discretion is strongly advised. The Appalachian Mountains have always held two kinds of secrets: the kind whispered around campfires, and the kind no one dares to speak of at all. Deep within the endless folds of shadowy ridges, where fog clings stubbornly to the earth and the silence of the woods feels alive, there lies a hillside long abandoned. To the unknowing, it is nothing more than a tangle of oaks, hemlocks, and briars strangling the remnants of a house. To the locals, however, it is a place they do not name. They call it simply that hillside, with a nod of the head, a glance away, and a tightening of the lips. The road to the hillside isn't marked on modern maps, though old-timers will tell you it was once part of a trade route. If you follow the creek north from Milford Hollow and keep climbing until your legs ache, you'll come to a break in the trees where the air feels heavier, as if every breath must be dragged through molasses. The birds do not sing there, and no matter how hot the summer sun burns, a chill seeps up from the soil. At the heart of this desolate rise lies the skeleton of a house. Its bones are rotting timbers blackened with mold, a collapsed roof sagging inward, and windows long gouged out, leaving dark sockets that stare emptily at whoever dares approach. Rusted nails jut from warped planks. A rust-colored handprint, weathered yet stubborn, stains one of the stone walls, as though it was pressed there in desperation a century ago and never faded. Few people in Milford will speak openly of the family who once claimed this hillside as their own. Outsiders who press too hard are met with a stony silence, or worse, a sharp warning. Some stories don't belong to daylight. Yet late at night, in bars thick with tobacco smoke and the creak of wooden stools, old men with whiskey-thick voices sometimes let fragments slip. That family, they weren't right. Cruel, that's the word. Cruel in ways you can't even imagine. Things happened up there. Things we still don't talk about. The rumors vary, but all agree on one thing. What happened on that hillside was not natural. The atmosphere of fear, it wasn't just the family themselves that bred unease. Even the land seemed twisted to match their character. Crops grown too close to their property rotted quicker than elsewhere. Hunters said game avoided the hillside entirely, as though deer and rabbits alike sensed a predator lurking there. Travelers who camped within sight of the homestead often woke in the night with the sensation of being watched, their fires dimming inexplicably low as if smothered by unseen hands. Children in Milford grew up with warnings whispered by mothers. Don't go playing near that hillside. It was said that if you climbed too close, you might hear voices calling from the trees. Familiar voices, even the voice of your mother or father, luring you deeper. Some children who ignored the warnings and dared each other to creep near swore they saw pale figures slipping between the trees. Yet when asked to describe these figures, they always faltered. Some said they were too tall, others too small, some human-shaped but bent wrong. The one detail that remained consistent was the eyes. Wide, glistening in the dark, watching. The first settlers silenced the earliest settlers of the region kept no written record of the family, but fragments of oral history suggest their presence stretches back nearly 2 centuries. They arrived not as pioneers of good standing, but as drifters, people without roots, carrying no ties, and claiming land no one else dared touch. The hillside was steep, the soil rocky, and the shadows heavy even at noon. No respectable farmer would have chosen it. And yet, this family built there. Some say they were running from something in Virginia or the Carolinas, a scandal, a crime, perhaps worse. Others whisper they brought something with them, something that belonged to the night rather than the day. Whatever the truth, the locals soon learned to avoid them. Neighbors complained of missing livestock. chickens vanishing without a trace, goats gutted as if by something too precise to be a wild animal. Farm dogs barked endlessly when the wind carried scents from that hillside, hackles raised, teeth bared at nothing visible. When preachers tried to bring the family into church gatherings, they were met with cold stares. The family seldom spoke, but when they did, it was with a sharpness that cut like knives. Their children, thin, hollow-eyed things, never joined the others at games, never sang hymns, never smiled. By the time the Civil War rolled through the Appalachians, the family was already a legend of fear. Soldiers marching past the valley were warned not to linger near the hillside. A few ignored the warnings. Their bones were never found. Whispers in the dark every generation added more stories to the legend. A peddler who vanished after knocking at their door. A farmhand whose body was discovered in the creek, face pale as milk, with strange carvings etched into his chest. A young woman from town who married one of the family sons and was never seen again, though her wedding dress was later found shredded and half-buried near the hillside. Still, the strangest detail was the silence of the townsfolk. Whenever a disappearance occurred, no sheriff was called, no search party organized. It was as though everyone knew the source of the horror but chose to look away. To speak against the family was to invite ruin. And so silence grew thick over the hillside, a silence that became ritual, almost sacred. A house that watches even in ruin. The house carries its own menace. Explorers who've wandered there in recent decades claim the structure changes. The shape of its walls appears different each time one glances back. Doorways seem narrower or wider or gone altogether. One man swore the second floor, which had collapsed decades earlier, appeared whole again in the moment before he fled. Another claimed that, while standing alone, he heard footsteps pacing above him. Some refused to even set foot inside, but those who do often report dreams that follow them for weeks. Dreams of standing in a cold room where shadows whisper their names. Dreams of laughter, high-pitched, cruel, childlike. Dreams of a dinner table set with rusted knives and cracked plates, all waiting, as though for them. The hillside does not forgive trespass. And the cruelest family Appalachia ever bore does not let its memory fade so easily. Every generation in Milford Hollow told its children the same thing. Don't let your feet wander past the creek. Don't climb the ridge. And don't look too long at that hillside. It wasn't merely superstition, it was survival. For reasons no one could quite explain, calamity followed those who ignored the warnings. Horses would go lame. Barns would burn without lightning. Children would sicken overnight with fevers no doctor could name. And always, there was the shadow of that family looming behind it all. It was said that the hillside absorbed cruelty like soil drinks rain. Each act of violence seeped into the ground, poisoning it, twisting roots and branches until even the trees grew in strange, crooked patterns. Some trunks bent back toward the house as if bowing, others split unnaturally, their cores black and soft with rot despite living leaves above. Hunters who cut through the hillside's forest swore they saw deer born with deformities. Legs too short, eyes clouded white, ribs showing through flesh even in summer. One hunter, old Caleb Myers, claimed he shot a buck near the ridge only to find its insides crawling with worms, though it had been alive minutes earlier. It weren't natural, he told anyone who'd listen. It were like the land itself was rejectin' life. First-hand accounts in 1891, a traveling circuit preacher, Reverend Elijah Crow, passed through Milford and made the mistake of visiting the hillside. He wrote in his journal, preserved in the county archives, "I have walked into dens of sin before, but never have I felt so oppressed by the very air itself. The homestead loomed like a carcass long dead yet unrotted. Its windows gaped, and I swore upon my faith that eyes peered from them, though the house was empty. The silence of the woods was total. No bird, no cricket, not even the wind. I called upon the Lord's name, and the echo of my voice came back broken, as if some other tongue spoke with me. I fled before nightfall, but even now, weeks later, I dream of that place. In my dreams, I do not run fast enough." He left Milford 2 days later and was never seen again. The journal was found abandoned in the church he had borrowed. Local folklore. By the turn of the 20th century, the Cruel family had already become part of Appalachian folklore. Old songs sung in hushed tones mentioned the children of the hill and their cold laughter. One lullaby, passed between mothers, carried a chilling verse. Sleep, child, sleep, don't you roam the night. The hillside's eyes don't need no light. Sleep, child, sleep, keep your soul inside, or the cruel ones come to take you for a ride. Children grew up with this rhyme etched into memory, though few understood its origins. Parents claimed it kept them safe. Children, however, whispered it like a dare when darkness fell, especially on storm nights when thunder rolled across the ridges. The visitors who never left between 1905 and 1920, at least 5 recorded cases of missing travelers were tied, in one way or another, to the hillside. Each story carried its own unease. The peddler, 1905, a man selling pots and pans, was last seen making his way toward the ridge after a woman reportedly told him the family might buy. His cart was found days later, horse still tethered, pawing nervously at the ground. The man was gone. His wares sat neatly stacked as though he had been called away mid-sale. The surveyor, 1912, when the county attempted to chart new road lines, a surveyor wandered into the woods near the family's land. His partner claimed he stepped off to relieve himself and never returned. Search parties combed the area but found only his compass lodged in the hollow of a tree, the glass face cracked, needle spinning without pause. The schoolteacher, 1919, a young woman named Sarah Whitcomb, accepted a teaching post in Milford, but disappeared on her second week. Some said she had been seen walking the creek trail, heading toward the ridge. Her schoolbooks later surfaced in a pawn shop 3 towns over, stained with water and something darker. With each disappearance, the hillside's reputation darkened. Yet still, no arrests were made, no investigations pursued. It was as though the land itself silenced inquiry. The watching windows, those who dared approach the house swore the windows watched them. Sometimes, even with no glass left, reflections shimmered in the frames. Faces pale and stretched thin, mouths too wide, eyes too dark. One mill worker who ventured close claimed he saw his own reflection in the window, but it smiled when he did not. Another explorer in the 1950s, armed with a newfangled camera, tried to capture photographs of the ruins. When developed, the film revealed not the house, but a dinner table set for 6, each chair occupied by gaunt figures staring directly into the lens. The photographer swore the house had been empty. He burned the photos within a week, but some say copies still circulate among collectors of Appalachian occult memorabilia. Milford Hollow was never a large place. A few dozen families, most of them coal miners or subsistence farmers, made up the backbone of the community. Life there was hard, but it was also bound together by an unspoken rule. Survival depended on silence. The family on the hillside had power, not in the way of wealth or politics, but in fear. And fear can be stronger than law. When a boy disappeared in 1923, 12-year-old Thomas Briggs, last seen fishing along the creek, the sheriff filed no report. His mother wailed for weeks, her cries carrying down Main Street, but neighbors averted their eyes. When the preacher suggested prayer vigils, half the town refused to come. They said openly, "Best not stir it, best not bring attention." It was as if the entire town had entered into a pact of omission. If you didn't name the hillside, perhaps it wouldn't name you in return. The house at night accounts vary on what the house looked like once the sun fell, but all share a common thread. It changed. Some locals claimed the windows glowed faintly, as if lit by lanterns, though the place had been abandoned for decades. Others swore music floated down the ridge. Fiddle strings played off-key, voices humming tunelessly, or sometimes the distant sound of children laughing. In the 1930s, a group of teenagers from the nearby coal camp dared one another to spend a night on the hillside. Only 3 of the 5 returned. They stumbled into town at dawn, clothes shredded, eyes wild, one of them unable to speak for the rest of his life. When pressed, the others muttered incoherently about the dinner table and mouths that didn't close. The sheriff ruled the missing 2 as runaways. But no one in Milford believed that. Strange weather over the ridge. Folks began to notice that storms gathered differently over the hillside. Rain would fall hard there, even when skies were clear in town. Lightning struck more often, always hitting the same warped oak tree at the property's edge, though it never split. Snow clung longer to that ridge, even when spring bloomed in the valley. Old mountain women said it was a veil, a shroud meant to keep the family's cruelty hidden, and anyone who stepped through it was marked. One miner, drunk at the tavern, claimed he once sheltered under that oak during a storm. He swore the rain never touched him there, though it soaked the ground at his feet. Instead, he felt warm breath on his neck and heard a woman whisper his name. When he turned, there was no one. He left town the next day. The stranger's warning: not all stories came from locals. In 1947, a traveler from Kentucky staggered into Milford, pale and trembling, clothes in tatters. He claimed he had been following an old trade trail when night fell, and he accidentally camped too close to the hillside. His story, recorded by the tavern owner in a notebook still kept by his family, described waking to the sound of footsteps circling his fire. He thought it was an animal until he saw bare feet moving just beyond the glow, dirty, long-toed, silent except for the crunch of leaves. When he called out, the steps stopped. Then, from the darkness, a dozen voices whispered his name at once. He ran, leaving behind his pack, his gun, even his boots. "Don't go near that ridge," he begged the townsfolk. "Ain't no family should be that cruel." He left barefoot, and the town never saw him again. The lingering smell: many who walked the boundary of the hillside reported a peculiar odor. It wasn't the sour scent of rot or the dampness of mold. It was something sharper, like rusted iron mixed with milk gone bad. Some said it was the smell of blood left too long in the air. Hounds brought near the ridge would whine and tuck tails between their legs. A farmer who once attempted to let his pigs forage on the slope found them dead the next morning, their mouths foaming, eyes bulging, skin pale as if drained. When he cut one open to see what sickness had taken it, he found the stomach empty. Not of food, but of organs. Hollow, as though something had eaten from the inside out. He burned the carcasses and never spoke of it again. The hillside in modern memory by the 1960s. The house had collapsed further, but the fear remained intact. Stories of the cruel family continued, passed down from grandparent to grandchild like heirlooms of terror. Hikers in the 1970s claimed they stumbled upon the ruins and found a staircase leading down into the earth. When they descended, they swore the air grew warm, thick, and wet like breath. They didn't stay long. When they returned with others a week later, the staircase was gone, buried beneath dirt and roots as if it had never existed. In the 1980s, amateur ghost hunters recorded themselves exploring the site. The tape, unearthed years later, captured them joking nervously until a child's voice interrupted, saying clearly, "Don't leave me here." The hunters fled, abandoning equipment. One of them later took his own life. Why the story persists even today. Those who drive the backroads of Appalachia whisper about the cruelest family. Tourists who ask for directions to the hillside are met with cold stares. Locals claim not to know where it is, though their eyes betray knowledge. The truth, if there is such a thing, may never be uncovered. But the hillside remains. The house, though decayed, still breathes. And the family, whether buried, burned, or merely hidden in shadow, waits. Because cruelty, once planted, does not die. It roots itself deep, spreading unseen, until one day it rises again. If the hillside was cursed ground, then the family who built upon it were the architects of its damnation. To understand their cruelty, one must look not only at what they did, but at the blood that made them. For cruelty was not merely a choice in that line. It was bred, cultivated, handed down like an heirloom Bible warped by fire. Origins in secrecy: the family's true surname is disputed. Some records list them as Hollingsworth, others as Halloway, and still others simply call them the Hollow Ones. What is agreed upon is that they first appeared in Western Virginia sometime in the late 1700s before crossing into the high ridges of Appalachia. No immigration papers were filed. No baptismal records survive. It was as though they emerged from the wilderness fully formed, a brood set apart. Even in those early days, whispers dogged them. A traveler's diary from 1792 described meeting a man of gaunt aspect, with eyes too pale and skin as if never touched by sun. The man, claiming to be the patriarch, traveled with 3 sons and 2 daughters. They purchased no land, built no ties, and vanished into the mountains where no other settlers dared go. Inbreeding and isolation over time, what might have begun as an ordinary family grew grotesque through isolation. With no outsiders marrying in, their bloodlines twisted back upon themselves. Children were born sickly, many never surviving infancy. Those who did survive often bore marks. Eyes too far apart, limbs too long, jaws crooked, skin prone to sores that never healed. Yet it was not only their bodies that reflected corruption. Their minds, too, seemed touched by something darker. Locals said the children spoke little but observed everything with unnerving intensity. Some could mimic voices perfectly, calling to neighbors in the sound of their own kin. Others were known to inflict pain on animals for amusement, pulling wings from birds, setting fire to cats, drowning dogs in barrels with laughter. The patriarch's rule, the first patriarch, whose name surfaces most often as Absalom, ruled his kin with an iron hand. He taught them that outsiders were not neighbors but prey, that kindness was weakness, and cruelty was strength. His doctrine was simple: family above all. Outsiders existed only for use. Pain is a lesson. To endure it makes you strong. To give it makes you powerful. Silence protects. No matter what happens, nothing leaves the hillside. Absalom's children were raised not with lullabies but with screams. Punishments were carved into flesh, disobedience starved out of them. He believed hunger kept them sharp, and so meals were meager, doled out only after displays of obedience or violence. One story claims Absalom once locked his youngest son in the root cellar for 9 days with nothing but a bucket of water. When the boy emerged, skeletal and weak, Absalom handed him a knife and demanded he kill one of his sisters to prove loyalty. No one knows what choice the boy made, only that the sister was never seen again. The second generation, by the mid-1800s, the family had multiplied. Cousins married cousins, and children were raised not by mothers or fathers but communally. Everyone belonged to Absalom's law. This generation grew even more warped. Some became hunters of men, roaming the woods to stalk travelers. Others became cunning manipulators, luring neighbors with feigned kindness before revealing their cruelty. One daughter, Esther, was said to be strikingly beautiful in youth. She seduced a farmer's son from town, who married her against his family's wishes. Within a year he was dead, his throat cut ear to ear. Esther returned to the hillside with his wedding ring and a child in her arms. The townsfolk whispered but did nothing. To accuse the hillside was to invite vengeance. The Book of Names, perhaps the most disturbing relic attributed to the family, is the so-called Book of Names. Several witnesses across decades spoke of its existence. A leather-bound ledger kept in the patriarch's keeping, its pages filled with the names of those who crossed the family. Each name was said to be marked with a date, either of disappearance, death, or suffering. Some who claimed to glimpse the book swore it contained not only the names of townsfolk, but names yet unborn. Children's names, future generations, as if the family had foreseen who they would one day harm. No one knows what became of the book after the family's collapse. Some say it burned in the fire that consumed the house. Others say it waits, buried under the hillside, still keeping tally. Cruelty as heritage. What separates this family from ordinary wickedness is how cruelty was not an act but a heritage. Each generation perfected it, sharpened it, made it their identity. Children were not taught to read or write, but they learned how to flay a rabbit alive by the age of 5. They were not taught hymns, but chants, ritualistic mutterings meant to bind them together in secrecy. To outsiders, they presented only suspicion. To one another, they presented only violence. The family tree became not a symbol of growth, but a gallows where branches bore the weight of cruelty's fruit. And so, blood begot blood, until cruelty itself seemed to flow in their veins. The Appalachian Mountains had always been shrouded in superstition. In whispers carried across hollers and valleys, people spoke of charms, hexes, and rites older than the country itself. But the family that lurked on the ridge had perfected their own darker craft. Their cruelty was not simply in their actions but in how they bound their victims' body, soul, and memory into an unending chain of servitude. Origins of the binding. The ritual had no written scripture. Passed only through word of mouth and enacted in blood, it relied on a mixture of old-world European folk practices and native superstitions scavenged and twisted to suit the family's hunger for dominance. It was said that the first patriarch had cut a deal, not with the devil of Christian lore, but with something older, a presence tied to the land itself. The binding was the price and the reward. Children raised within the family grew up knowing that loyalty was not just expected, but enforced. When they turned 13, they were taken into the woods by torchlight, barefoot, and made to swear themselves to the family's keeper spirit. A cut across the palm, a drop of blood into the fire, and an incantation that none of them understood, but all of them felt. It was not a choice. It was a shackle. The victim's role, the family's cruelty, extended outward. Travelers, wanderers, and even the occasional unlucky neighbor were chosen as offerings. Bound by rope, stripped of names and identities, they were made part of the ritual. Their screams became a hymn, their silence a confirmation. The binding demanded not just obedience but remembrance. Every victim's suffering was folded into the soil, into the timber of the family's home, into the marrow of their descendants. To disobey the elders was to awaken the wrath of those nameless spirits that had been fed and silenced. And so generation after generation, cruelty became more than a tradition, it became a necessity. The ceremony at the hollow, one particular account, pieced together from fragments of testimony whispered decades later, described the binding ceremony that took place deep in a hollow so quiet that even birds refused to sing there. Torches ringed a clearing. In the center stood a crude stone altar, slick with generations of dried offerings. Bound upon it was a boy, no older than 10, taken not from outside, but from within the family itself. His crime had been hesitation, a failure to strike an animal during a training hunt. His punishment was not death, but worse. They slit his palm, dripped his blood on the stone, and chanted until his eyes glazed over. Witnesses said his screams ceased suddenly, replaced with a chilling calm. From that night onward, he no longer spoke in his own voice. He became a hollow vessel, serving the family's will without question. His humanity stripped away. The binding, they claimed, had claimed him fully. Whispered consequences, but with each ritual, the family seemed to lose something of themselves. Madness ran thicker than blood. Generations grew meaner, more feral, their eyes sunken, their skin gray and stretched. Inbreeding was part of it, but the binding made it worse. It tethered them not only to each other but to the ancient presence they had bargained with. Those who tried to flee were found mutilated. Their bodies posed at the edge of the forest like scarecrows. Those who stayed lived in fear of the elder's next command. The ritual ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death. The outsider who saw too much. By the mid-20th century, rumors of the binding spread beyond the mountain. A young folklorist from Virginia, fascinated by stories of Appalachian witchcraft, ventured into the ridge to document the family. His journals, recovered years later, described a midnight procession he stumbled upon. He wrote of figures moving in single file, their faces painted with ash, their voices droning in a rhythm older than words. He wrote of the altar, of the torches, and of the boy bound to the stone. His last entry ended mid-sentence, scrawled in panic. The journal was found abandoned in the woods, its pages splattered with something dark. The folklorist was never seen again. This was not merely cruelty. This was architecture, a family built on bondage, ritual, and the eternal recycling of suffering. And the ritual of binding ensured that their horror was not confined to one generation. It was eternal. The wind that clawed through Black Hollow in the autumn of 1968 carried with it more than the dry leaves scraping against hollow logs. It carried whispers, rumors among the nearby valleys that the cruel family atop the ridge had thinned in number. Their empire of silence, once so secure, was breaking apart like shale beneath a swollen river. Outsiders noticed fewer lanterns burning in the manor at night, fewer hunting parties descending into town to trade in their crude way. The family that had outlived wars, plagues, and the constant churn of government interference now seemed fragile. But fragility in the hands of cruelty does not mean weakness. It often means desperation. Inside the decaying halls of the mountain estate, only 3 members of the bloodline remained. Matriarch Eliza, her son Jonah, and Jonah's twin daughters, Mercy and Magdalene. Their house smelled of rot and iron, the kitchen shelves stacked with jars of preserved gifts no one dared to question. Dust settled thick upon the portraits of ancestors whose gazes seemed to follow every movement. And beneath the floorboards, down where the stone foundation met earth, were chambers never meant to be discovered. The twins, barely 16, grew up knowing the house was alive with secrets. Mercy was quiet, watchful, her eyes too old for her face. Magdalene was restless, a creature of rebellion, her spirit constantly testing the bars of the cage their family called duty. But neither could escape their mother's whisper. "You were born to continue what was begun before time marked us. Without you, our blood dries. Without you, we are forgotten." Jonah, their father, carried his cruelty like a badge, but behind his gruffness was exhaustion. He had witnessed too many winters, buried too many of his kin, and seen too much of the world change while his own family remained rooted in a tradition more ancient than law. He drank from bottles of rust-colored liquor to silence the guilt he refused to name. Eliza, however, was different. She embodied the cold marrow of the family's legacy. Withered in body but not in will, she was said to have memorized every rite, every ritual, every oath sworn in candlelight and sealed in blood. She told the girls stories of their forebears, how cruelty was survival, how sacrifice was necessary, how outsiders were always enemies. "Compassion is the sickness of the weak," she told them. "Do not forget it, for the world will eat you alive if you dare show kindness." And so, the stage was set. 2 daughters bound to inherit a legacy older than the soil beneath their home, guided by a father who faltered and a grandmother who would never surrender. But the hills whispered rebellion. By the time the first snow fell, Magdalene had made secret contact with a boy from the valley, a mill worker's son who had seen her wandering the ridge. He told her of the towns, the music, the electricity that lit up homes without lanterns. He told her of freedom, and she listened, hungry for the taste of something her family had forbidden. Mercy, however, sensed danger in every glance, every word, every promise. That winter, Eliza began preparing them for the ritual of succession. It would be their passage into adulthood, their binding to the family's will. What the ritual required, Eliza never fully explained, only that it demanded loyalty, blood, and sacrifice. Jonah resisted. His voice, once thunderous in the halls, broke into cracks when he argued with his mother. "They are just children," he pleaded. But Eliza silenced him with a stare that carried the weight of centuries. The night of the first preparation, the twins were led beneath the manor into the chamber carved from stone. Torches burned on the walls, throwing shadows that seemed to breathe. In the center lay a long table of oak, stained black from generations of use. The air was heavy with the smell of herbs, blood, and something older, like soil pulled from graves long undisturbed. "Here," Eliza said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "you will learn who you are. You will learn why the world must fear you, and why you must never fear it." The girls trembled, but not for the same reason. Mercy trembled because she knew she would obey. Magdalene trembled because she knew she could not. What followed that night would mark the family forever. For beneath the earth, among the cries that were never meant to escape the stone walls, one daughter swore herself to the family, and one swore herself to destroy it. And the hills would not forget. Night the last air stirred. The mountains groaned as if some ancient wound split open again. A storm gathered above, dragging thunder like chains across the sky. Those who lived closest to the hollow swore they heard the ground sigh, an exhale of damp rot, as though the hills themselves were weary of holding back what had long been buried. The cruelest Appalachian family, thought to have withered in whispers and blood-soaked silence, was not gone. One had survived. Not by chance, not by mercy, but by a design older than any remembered prayer. The heir's name was Clementine Wraithwood, though in county records she was little more than a forgotten note. A stillborn infant in the year 1894, buried before she'd drawn breath. But the truth, of course, was fouler. The Wraithwoods never let death decide. They bargained with it. They stitched their bloodlines together in shadow. Clementine had not been stillborn. She had been hidden, cradled in a cellar that breathed mildew, fed not by sunlight but by marrow rituals and the copper taste of sacrificed animals. Her survival was improbable, grotesque. Generations of inbreeding and cruel experiment had twisted her flesh. Her body was slight, almost brittle, but her eyes glowed unnaturally pale, reflecting light even in pitch dark like a predator's. She spoke little as a child. When she finally did, her first words were not words at all but the mimicry of screams she'd overheard during rites in the cellar. By the time the family had dwindled into near extinction, Clementine was their secret ember. Too fragile to be unleashed in youth, she was instead conditioned, molded like damp clay to one purpose: carry the Wraithwood name forward when the rest had rotted. When she emerged, decades later, she was neither young nor old, neither fully woman nor something human. She carried with her the entire rot of her lineage, as if her skin was parchment inked with ancestral curses. And her awakening was not a quiet thing. The first to sense her return was a preacher named Silas Wren, whose chapel sat crooked on the edge of Pine Hollow. That night, during the storm, the stained glass window depicting Christ's resurrection cracked in half, splitting down the figure's face. Silas claimed he saw a girl's reflection in the broken glass. White eyes, pale lips, hair as black as coal dust. Behind her stood shapes that were not people but a blur of limbs and teeth. He thought it a hallucination, until he found muddy, barefoot tracks outside the chapel door, small, narrow, and stopping at the threshold. Word spread, the way it always does in the Appalachians, carried not by newspapers but by whispers at gas stations, murmurs in logging camps, and fearful mutterings at kitchen tables. The Wraithwoods are back. The last one walks. Folklore hardened around Clementine almost instantly. Some said she was born without a heart. Others swore she had two shadows, one that followed, and one that walked ahead of her, scouting the way. Still others whispered that animals went mute in her presence, their throats closing around sound itself. But what no one doubted was this: she had inherited every cruelty her ancestors wielded. And unlike those before her, she had no siblings to compete with, no patriarch's authority to bend her. She was free. Clementine's first act was to reclaim the Wraithwood house. The mansion had stood silent for decades, sagging under vines, its windows hollow eyes staring over the valley. Hunters had avoided it. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and touch the doorknob, but no one had lived there since the last firelit rites of her kin. When Clementine returned, the house breathed. Locals swore they saw smoke curl from the chimney though no wood was burned, heard doors slam though no wind stirred, windows lit with a pale glow though no lanterns flickered inside. It was as if the house itself recognized its mistress. And then came the sounds at night, screams muffled under floorboards, the dragging of chains, laughter, not in joy but in hunger. If the Wraithwoods had once been cruel to outsiders, Clementine's cruelty was more intimate. She didn't just lash at strangers. She lured them in. The first was a traveling nurse, Miss Halloran, who made weekly rounds to the isolated homesteads. When she failed to return, her bicycle was found rusting near the gate of the Wraithwood house, its tires punctured by something sharper than nails. Her satchel was recovered days later, hanging from a tree like a warning charm. Inside were vials of blood, labeled in handwriting not her own. The sheriff organized a search party, but none dared cross the threshold of the hollow. By the third day, they found what was left of Miss Halloran's body. Not buried, not hidden, but displayed on the porch rocker, her eyes gouged and replaced with river stones. Pinned to her chest with an iron nail was a scrap of parchment. On it, A single phrase written in crimson. The Wraithwoods remain. What made Clementine more terrifying than her kin was her patience. She didn't feast and discard like the others. She curated terror, spreading it piece by piece through the valley until fear itself felt like part of the weather. Children dreamed of her shadow. Men refused to hunt the forests after dusk. Women locked their cellars and hung salt across their doors. Yet no measure was enough. For Clementine was not just the last heir. She was the distilled venom of generations. And unlike the others, she wanted not only to preserve the Wraithwood name but to make it eternal. Her awakening was only the beginning, and the mountains, long used to holding secrets, groaned louder with each passing night, as though even they wanted to spit her out. The ridge stood silent, its trees swaying like watchmen in the mist, but beneath the soil, beneath the timbers of the Blackwood cabin, there was something binding every generation together. The oath, the blood, the silence. They had a saying in the family, "The mountain takes, but we decide how." And it was true. Would you like me to start pouring out part 2 in full now? Or do you want me to give you a summary skeleton first, like a roadmap of the 15,000 words? So you know how the arc of this will be written in immersive, cinematic narrative style with dialogue, atmosphere, psychological unease, and interwoven history. The Blackwood Ridge was a place no one named aloud in town, at least not without lowering their voice. To outsiders, it was just another patch of thick Appalachian woodland, its timberline bristling like the spine of some great beast curled in sleep. But for the family who lived at the crest, the Blackwoods, those woods were not simply shelter. They were a covenant, a territory that answered back. They called it the Ridge, never anything else, as though naming it might thin the veil between its soil and the unspoken promises buried beneath. And it was there, in the heart of that silence, that the oath was kept. The gathering every child of the Blackwoods remembered their first gathering. It did not happen yearly, nor on a fixed date, but whenever the eldest of the clan deemed the time had come. Sometimes the moon was new, sometimes the trees burned red in October, sometimes a storm raged outside while they lit lanterns within. The gatherings always began the same way. Silence, broken only by the sound of boots scuffing against wood, as the family filed into the long room of the Ridge House. The Ridge House itself was older than any paper deed suggested. It leaned against the mountain like a stubborn animal, patched and rebuilt after fires, storms, and winters, but never abandoned. Its windows seemed too narrow for their walls, its roof too steep, as though the design had come from a memory rather than a plan. The long room stretched like a spine through the cabin, and at its center was a table of thick oak, gouged and blackened by years of use. No one used that table for meals. It was a table of oaths. That night, lanterns hissed with oil smoke. The eldest of the family, a woman named Marjorie Blackwood, crooked with age and eyes sharp as tacks, sat at the head. In her lap she held a ledger bound in hide so cracked it might have been bark peeled from a tree. The children stood pressed against their mother's skirts, their eyes wide. "Tonight," Marjorie rasped, "you learn what makes you Blackwood." The oath was not spoken in plain English. It came half in whispers, half in an old dialect of the hills, words that no outsider could follow. Yet every child learned it by heart before they were grown. The ritual was simple, at least on the surface. A hand placed on the ledger, a drop of blood on the page, a vow whispered, never loud enough for the trees to hear, but the weight of it sank into the marrow. "You belong to us," the oath said, though the words were never written. "You belong to the Ridge. You will carry the silence. You will keep the cruelty. You will pass it on." Some children trembled. Some cried. None were excused. The ledger filled with names, each followed by dates. Sometimes the dates stretched into adulthood. Sometimes they ended in childhood. No one explained why. And as the child's blood dried on the page, Marjorie would dip her finger in ash from the hearth and mark their forehead. "Mountain keeps what's given," she would whisper. The others echoed, "Mountain keeps." Outsiders, the oath was not only about blood. It was about secrecy. If an outsider stumbled too close to the Ridge House, if a hunter followed game onto the wrong trail or a peddler lingered too long, the family would close ranks. They spoke little, but they watched everything. Sometimes the outsider was turned away, bewildered, half convinced they had been dreaming when they reached town again. Other times, they did not return at all. The townsfolk whispered about vanishings, hunters who never came home, drifters who left no trail, even a census man who failed to file his report. Yet no lawman ever reached the ridge. The silence of the family stretched outward like a net, holding back questions before they could be asked. For the Blackwoods, cruelty was not violence for pleasure's sake. It was utility, a boundary maintained, an oath enforced. The ledger of names one night, when the storm clawed at the shutters, young Thomas Blackwood, barely 12, dared to sneak a glance at the ledger while Marjorie slept by the fire. The pages were filled not only with names but with symbols, dates paired with marks. Some crosses, some circles, some strange angular scratches that looked less like writing and more like tally marks from a hand too unsteady to care about meaning. He traced his own name with his fingertip. The date of his birth was marked. So too, in red ink, was a second date not yet come. Thomas shivered. He never asked what the second date meant. But he noticed his cousin's name, Anna, had 2 dates as well, and hers was only a month away. The next time he saw Anna, her eyes were hollow, as if she already knew. Inheritance of cruelty, the oath shaped the family like a mold. Children learned early that silence was survival, that pity was weakness, that cruelty was not chosen but expected, like work in the field or prayer before sleep. If a child refused, the ridge broke them. There were stories of children left in the woods overnight, their cries swallowed by the wind until they returned quiet, eyes downcast. Some did not return at all. The cruelty was not always physical. It was in the way fathers withheld warmth, the way mothers spoke in riddles, the way siblings were pitted against one another. Love was conditional, always measured against loyalty to the oath. Over time, the children grew to carry the cruelty as naturally as breath. They learned to laugh without joy, to hold secrets like coins, to smile when others suffered. And when their time came, they brought their own children to the table, pressing small hands to the ledger, watching the ash mark their brows. The oath was not broken. It never would be. High on the ridge, the family gathered in the lantern glow, ash on their brows, blood drying on paper, eyes reflecting the fire. And outside, in the endless dark of the Appalachian night, the mountain listened. The oath pulsed through the soil, through the roots, through the bones buried deep where no outsider would ever find them. The ridge kept its silence. The mountain kept what was given. The Appalachian Ridge lay smothered in an almost unnatural silence that winter, a silence heavy enough to press on the chest, as though the mountains themselves held their breath. Snow had fallen thick across the gnarled branches and crooked fences that ringed the Bledsoe family's homestead, burying the black soil beneath a white shroud. The cabins, squat, rotting things with chimneys that breathed smoke as though coughing, stood like scars against the blank landscape. Inside, the fire snapped in the hearth, but its warmth did little to thaw the ice that had begun to creep into the Bledsoe bloodline itself. The fracturing of the family for generations, the Bledsoes had lived by a strict and cruel hierarchy. The eldest male carried the title of keeper, while the women were relegated to breeders, caretakers, and in darker whispers, vessels for the family's twisted experiments with purity and power. But now, after Amos's brutal leadership, his death left a hollow space at the head of the table. Ezekiel, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, seized control with fists rather than tradition. He believed cruelty was the only glue strong enough to bind their decaying dynasty. His brothers followed grudgingly, while his sisters simmered with resentment, their eyes darting toward the woods as though escape lay only a shadow away. The old rules began to crack. Whispers filled the night air, rumors of hidden children, betrayals of blood, and pacts made in secret. The ledger of names, it was Ruth, the family matron, who unearthed the ledger from beneath a rotting floorboard in the root cellar. The book was bound in thick leather, its edges blackened by damp, its pages crawling with cramped handwriting. Inside was a genealogical record of every Bledsoe birth, death, and disappearance stretching back over a century. But what chilled Ruth wasn't the names she recognized. It was the ones she didn't. Entire branches of the family tree had been carefully struck through with charcoal lines. Some entries bore a single chilling note: unworthy. Others, given to the hills. These weren't just records, they were verdicts. Evidence of a legacy built on choosing which children lived under the family roof and which were offered to whatever waited in the woods. The whispering blood, the ledger, spread through the household like fire. Each sibling interpreted it differently. Ezekiel claimed it proved their ancestors' strength, that sacrifice was the foundation of survival. "We are chosen," he said, slamming his fist against the ledger's spine. "And chosen blood must be kept pure." But Ruth's daughter, Miriam, saw it as evidence of betrayal. Whole generations erased, infants cast out like refuse. Her distrust spread like infection, infecting her sisters, who began meeting in hushed secrecy in the barn loft, planning rebellion. At night, Miriam swore she heard the voices of those erased. Children crying, women wailing, echoing from the woods. The betrayal within it was Caleb, Ezekiel's youngest brother, who finally broke. Unlike Ezekiel, Caleb was slight, wiry, with the restless energy of a man perpetually haunted. He despised Ezekiel's cruelty but lacked the strength to defy him openly. Instead, he began smuggling scraps of food to a hidden cabin in the forest, where, unknown to the rest, he sheltered one of the unworthy children who had survived exile. Her name was Liddy, a girl no older than 12, her eyes glassy with hunger yet burning with feral rage. She was kin, but she was no longer entirely human in her mannerisms. Raised by shadows, she moved in silence, her face streaked with mud and soot. Caleb whispered promises to protect her, but Liddy never answered. She only stared at him with a gaze that seemed both accusing and demanding. When Miriam discovered Caleb's secret, she didn't turn him in. Instead, she saw Liddy as proof that Ezekiel's doctrine of purity was a lie. But Ezekiel was not blind. The trial by fire on a night when the wind howled like wolves across the holler. Ezekiel gathered the family in the barn. Torches lined the walls, throwing jagged shadows across the faces of the Bledsoe clan. In the center, Caleb knelt bound, his shirt torn, his chest heaving. Beside him stood Liddy, dragged in by Ezekiel's men, her hair matted, her thin arms pinned by ropes. "You would shelter weakness," Ezekiel thundered, spittle flying from his lips. "You would betray your blood for the unworthy." The family murmured, some in agreement, others uneasy. Ezekiel threw the ledger onto the dirt floor, its pages fanning open to the erased names. "This book is our law. Betrayal of it is betrayal of us all." He demanded Caleb prove his loyalty by casting Liddy into the fire pit at the barn's center. Caleb's eyes flooded with tears. He shook his head violently. "She is kin, blood of our blood." But Ezekiel's voice cracked like a whip. "Then you shall burn with her." The inferno as flames licked the hay. Chaos erupted. Miriam screamed and hurled a lantern into the rafters, igniting the dry wood. In the pandemonium, sisters rushed to cut Liddy free. Caleb broke his bonds in the confusion, and together they fled into the snowstorm outside. Behind them, the barn roared with fire, collapsing timbers screaming as the structure gave way. Inside, Ezekiel's shouts were drowned by the thunder of burning beams. Some said he perished there. Others whispered he walked out, blackened and broken, yet alive with something unnatural seething in his blood. The new divide with the barn reduced to smoldering ash. The Bledsoe family split in two. Miriam, Caleb, and those who followed them fled deeper into the mountains, vowing to undo the family's twisted legacy. Those loyal to Ezekiel clung tighter to the creed of purity, rebuilding their home with even harsher devotion. The hills themselves seemed to divide, half cloaked in silence, half echoing with restless voices. The bloodline had fractured, and with it, the cruelty that had held them together began to scatter like embers on the wind. But cruelty, once rooted, never dies. It mutates, it spreads, and sometimes it waits in silence. The hollow was never truly empty. Even in silence, it breathed, a lung of earth hidden deep between the folds of the Appalachian ridges. What the town knew as a simple depression in the hills was, to the Calder family, the very stage of their darkest inheritances. To stand at its center was to feel the mountain pulse, its heartbeat muffled under roots and stone, and it was there that their rituals unfurled like black smoke from a dying fire. The path leading to the hollow was one nobody dared to walk unless bound by blood or terror. It wound downward, thick with briars that seemed deliberately cultivated to snag flesh. The Calders believed no stranger should arrive without first bleeding for the soil. A trail of thorn scratches was a rite of passage, ensuring that those who entered had offered some fragment of themselves to the earth long before the ceremony began. The hollow itself was ringed with crooked trees, each scarred by old carvings. Symbols nobody could decipher, neither English nor Latin, but older, looping shapes that twisted in on themselves. To some eyes, they looked like serpents devouring their tails. To others, they resembled the knots of entrails pulled from a slaughtered animal. No carving was fresh, yet none had faded, as if the bark itself had fused with the markings, carrying them forward through generations. At night, when the torches flared, the hollow became alive with shadows. The Calders did not chant in unison, as outsiders might imagine of a cult. Their voices layered unevenly, muttering at different tempos, an unsettling fugue of syllables that overlapped and contradicted. Children were placed at the center, ringed by their elders, taught to mimic the nonsense tones until their voices cracked into harmony. What began as babble became rhythm, and from rhythm, the air thickened with something foul, like swamp gas rising. The centerpiece of their rituals was never a cross or altar but a pit, no deeper than 6 feet, yet lined with bones. Animal, human, or both, it was impossible to tell. When the Calders gathered, they carried offerings not in baskets but in burlap sacks, wet and dripping. Some contained rabbits, still squirming. Others, chickens with eyes wide and frantic. And sometimes, when the hollow was deemed especially hungry, the sacks trembled with shapes too large, too heavy to be beasts of the field. Those chosen for sacrifice were never called victims. The Calders called them echoes, a word that suggested continuation rather than ending. The belief was simple and monstrous. What entered the pit did not die but reverberated, its essence absorbed into the hollow, feeding the mountain so that it in turn might feed them. In truth, the echoes were screams, carried into the trees where they bounced and warped until no human ear could identify them. Witnesses who survived spoke of how the torches dimmed when the pit was fed, as if their fire feared the hollow's appetite. The ground itself quivered. Some claimed to see faces in the dirt, straining upward like drowning souls beneath ice. The Calders answered not with fear but reverence. Their youngest would press their palms flat to the soil, grinning, whispering to the ground as though to a mother. The rituals were not without purpose. Every Calder believed their survival depended on them. Crops grew in strange abundance in the fields nearest the hollow. Cattle born on their land bore no disease. Even in winters where neighbors starved, the Calders feasted. But each blessing exacted its price, and with each generation, the hollow demanded more than chickens and pigs. By the mid-1800s, it whispered insistently for human echoes, and the family obliged. Travelers went missing most often. Peddlers who wandered into the hills with wares never reached their next stop. Stories spread of a family of shadows that lured the lost deeper until they vanished. Yet locals whispered another truth. Sometimes, the Calders did not wait for strangers. Sometimes they turned on their own. When a child was born sickly, when an uncle grew too old to work the land, when whispers of dissent rose, those became echoes too. One legend tells of a night when lightning struck the edge of the hollow, illuminating it brighter than day. Neighbors watching from a ridge swore they saw dozens of pale forms writhing in the pit, climbing over one another, silent yet desperate, their eyes reflecting the flames. And when the storm passed, the trees around the hollow were slick with something dark, something that dripped and stained the earth for weeks. By the turn of the century, the hollow was more than ritual ground. It was the Calder family archive. Bones arranged in patterns marked events. The joining of two bloodlines, the death of a patriarch, the season of famine survived. Each pile was a ledger, each skull an entry. To read the hollow was to read their family history, though no outsider could ever interpret its logic. Those who stumbled too close to the hollow often felt themselves pulled by unseen weight. Hunters described falling silent against their will, unable to whistle or call to their dogs. The woods themselves seemed to hush, as though conspiring. One hunter, a man named Elias Hart, was found half-mad in a creek bed miles away, his hands clawed and raw. He spoke of roots that writhed like snakes, of voices calling him by name though he'd never met the family. He never returned to the mountains. The Calders thrived in this secrecy, their rituals binding them as much as their blood. The children grew without fear of death, for to them, it was not an end but a transformation into echo. Parents would soothe their infants by whispering lullabies about the hollow, crooning promises that the earth remembers us all. What others saw as monstrous, the Calders framed as eternal belonging. But even among themselves, doubt sometimes festered. There were Calders who could not bear the pit's hunger, who flinched when the ground moaned, who vomited when the torches dimmed. These were not tolerated. Some vanished in the night, their absence explained away as wanderlust or misfortune. Yet those who knew the hollow understood they, too, had been offered. And the mountain listened, always. By the time the sun began to wither behind the jagged mountain ridge, the Van Horn estate was no longer just an abandoned homestead rotting on a hill. It was a gaping wound in the Appalachians, leaking its stories into the valleys below. Generations of cruelty had left their fingerprints on every rotted timber, every scorched field, every scar in the soil where bones might still lie. For decades, silence was the family's greatest weapon. Silence in the face of neighbors' questions. Silence when children vanished in the woods. Silence when drifters entered the mountain trails and never returned. But silence is not eternal. The mountain itself began to rebel, coughing up its secrets through storms, broken ground, and the whispers that carried from one town to another. The fading dominion of the Van Horns, the last living descendants, clung to their cursed land like weeds gripping stone. Ruth Van Horn, gaunt and skeletal in her rocking chair, ruled over the remaining kin with the venom of an empress. Her eyes were pale, nearly blind, but her tongue lashed sharper than the blade she kept by her side. Her children, 3 malformed men and 1 daughter born broken from years of inbreeding, were shadows of the cruelty that had once thrived. The men rarely spoke. They moved with the heaviness of men who'd never lived beyond the treeline. The daughter, Elsie, was different. Born with a limp and a face that seemed eternally bruised by fate, she gazed longingly at the road whenever strangers passed. To her, the outside world was not something to fear but something to ache for. But Ruth would never allow it. She bound her brood with guilt and terror, reminding them of the blood debt they carried, that the mountain itself would consume them if they strayed too far. The curse made flesh. It was said that every cruel act leaves behind a mark, not only on the soul but on the earth. The Van Horns had carved thousands of such marks. The woods around their land grew darker than elsewhere, even in daylight. Travelers swore they heard children crying in the underbrush or smelled meat cooking where no campfire burned. The family themselves bore deformities. Twisted spines, extra digits, eyes that gleamed oddly in the moonlight. Some said this was God's punishment for their cruelty. Others whispered it was the mountain's own curse, shaping them into monsters to match their deeds. Still, Ruth believed they were chosen. "Our suffering is our strength," she croaked at night. "And strength is the only thing the world respects." Outsiders returned by the mid-20th century. Outsiders began pressing deeper into Appalachia. Historians, folklorists, and treasure seekers chasing whispers of buried silver and lost settlements. Some stumbled upon the Van Horn Hills. A handful even reached the house. Most never came back. But one group did. 3 men from Charleston, educated, curious, and foolish, arrived under the guise of surveyors. They had heard rumors of a hidden family practicing rituals in the mountains, of caves filled with carved symbols older than the settlers themselves. For them, the story was treasure enough. The Van Horns welcomed them in with silence. They let the men eat their food, drink their water, and sleep under their roof. Then, as dawn broke, only 2 of the outsiders walked away alive. The third was buried somewhere beneath the hog pen. The survivors told no one the truth. They only whispered, in bars and boarding houses, of a family that should never be visited again. The breaking of the line. Ruth's death was the beginning of the end. She passed one winter night, slumped in her chair, her lips curled into a smile as if she had defeated even death itself. But her children were not strong enough to carry on the empire of cruelty she had built. The eldest son drank himself to death within a year. The youngest wandered into the mountains and was found months later, gnawed down to bone. Elsie ran. No one knew how she escaped, but some say she was seen in a coal town far east, working in a laundry, her limp dragging behind her. She never gave her real name. Perhaps she hoped to bury her bloodline in silence. The 2 remaining brothers, broken and bitter, turned on each other. Their feud ended in fire, the old Van Horn house burning like a beacon on the hillside. Neighbors said they could hear the screams carried by the wind, as if the mountain itself was finally taking back what was owed. A legacy that refused to die, and yet, even after the fire, the land did not heal. Hunters still avoided the hollow. Children dared each other to climb the ridge, only to return pale and trembling, swearing they heard their names whispered from the trees. The cruelty of the Van Horns had sunk too deep. Their bloodline might be shattered, but their mark remained. Some say their spirits wander still, looking for kin to carry on the old traditions. Others claim a handful of descendants still hide in the remote hills, passing their secrets down in shadows. And so, the name lived on, not in history books or church records, but in warnings murmured over campfires. Don't go near the Van Horn land. The mountain remembers. The Blackthorn Holler was never silent, even when the cicadas quit their screeching and the owls held their breath. Something lived in the stillness, something woven into the ground itself, stitched into the soil by the cruel hands of generations. The Blackthorn family called it tradition. Outsiders, those few who stumbled close enough to hear the whispers drifting out of the holler, called it witchcraft. But in truth it was something darker, older, and infinitely more cruel. The hollow where secrets gathered by the time young Elias Blackthorn turned 16. His family considered him old enough to take the oath. That was what they called it, though no preacher or Bible had anything to do with it. The oath was whispered in a clearing ringed with rotting sycamores, where the earth dipped low, forming a hollow that smelled of wet moss and iron. At night, the family would gather there. Uncles, cousins, children with wide eyes and blood still wet on their knuckles from slaughtering pigs or rabbits for practice. The matriarch, cold-eyed and stone-faced as the mountain ridges, would stand at the center, holding a lantern that burned with bare fat. Elias remembered how his father pushed him forward, his calloused hand gripping the back of his neck. "Time you learn the truth of us, boy," his father whispered, voice thick with pride and warning. The clearing was hushed except for the groan of the trees in the wind. Then, as if in rehearsed unison, the family began their chant. Not words in English, no, they were syllables older than the hills, scraped raw from some forgotten tongue. And Elias, trembling, was handed the knife. The knife and the blood, it wasn't just a hunting blade. The thing was ancient, its handle carved from bone, its edge blackened and serrated like it had eaten more than meat in its long service. They didn't start him on animals. No, his first oath was written in the blood of a trespasser. The man was already bound, his mouth gagged with burlap, his eyes wild and pleading in the lantern light. He was no stranger, just a peddler who had taken the wrong trail and wandered into Blackthorn land. "Do it," the matriarch hissed, "or you ain't no kin of ours." The family circled closer, their breaths hot in the hollow night. Elias's heart pounded in his ears as he raised the knife. And when he brought it down, carving life from flesh, the clearing erupted in cries, not of horror, but of praise. That was how they bound their children. That was how the rituals lived on. The holler's song, the bodies were never buried whole. Pieces were scattered through the woods, fed to the hogs, boiled in cauldrons of fat to preserve bones and teeth. The air of the holler reeked of smoke and iron. Children grew up learning that cruelty was not just expected, but celebrated. Kindness was weakness. Mercy was betrayal. And so they cut it from themselves piece by piece until only cruelty remained. But what bound the family together wasn't merely bloodlust. They believed the holler itself rewarded them for the pain they sowed. Crops grew tall where bones were buried. Game wandered close, dumb and unafraid. Storms skirted their ridges, sparing their cabins while the neighboring farms were drowned. Blood feeds the soil, the matriarch would croon, her voice carrying through the night like the creak of a coffin lid. And the soil feeds us. And the children listened and believed. The outsider's discovery once. A preacher wandered too close, driven by rumors of strange folk who refused the church. He carried his Bible high, his voice ringing through the trees. "Turn from your wickedness," he cried. "The Lord sees all." The family watched from the shadows, their faces blank. Then, with the ease of wolves, they surrounded him. Elias, still new to his oath, was forced to lead the act. He hesitated only once, when the preacher locked eyes with him, whispering a prayer for the boy's soul. But hesitation meant punishment. And so Elias's knife struck again, and the hollow gained another secret. The ritual that went too far, it wasn't always perfect. Sometimes the holler demanded more than the family could give. One summer, after drought shriveled their crops, the matriarch declared the soil was starving. The family gathered at the clearing, lanterns casting long shadows across their faces. "This time," she said, "we give it one of our own." The children froze. Even the men stirred uneasily. But no one dared defy her. And so a cousin, barely 8 years old, was chosen. His screams still haunted Elias years later. A memory burned deeper than any scar. But after that sacrifice, rain returned. Corn grew tall. Livestock fattened. The family took it as proof. The cruelty was not just tradition, it was necessity. The final winter of the crows was unlike any that had come before. The mountains themselves seemed to anticipate the end. Their ridgelines wrapped in mist, their hollows filled with a silence so profound it pressed against the skin. By then, the stories of the Cruelest Appalachian family had spread across counties like infection. Preachers invoked them in sermons. Children whispered their name at campfires. Outsiders dared not wander into Crow territory, for fear of being swallowed whole by the land that had kept them hidden for nearly 2 centuries. But inside the rotting house on the hillside, their empire was collapsing. The patriarch who once ruled through terror was gone, his bones gnawed by time and secrecy. The younger heirs had scattered, some dead, some vanished into the same woods that once protected them. What remained was the core of a family too consumed by hatred to leave and too weak to continue. Hunger grew merciless. With every passing season, the soil yielded less. The once booming cries of livestock that had filled their barn fell silent, the pens collapsing into weeds. The rivers thinned, fish dwindled, and the forest, as if exacting revenge, turned barren. It was as though nature itself had turned its back on them. The Crow matriarch, old, skeletal, with eyes black as coal, refused to abandon the homestead. She sat before the crumbling fireplace day after day, whispering to the shadows that lingered in the corners. Some said she called upon the spirits of the dead, binding them to her failing children. Others claimed she had struck a bargain with the land itself, offering blood for survival. Her youngest son, Silas, gaunt and pale, began keeping watch on the ridge. Neighbors swore they saw him standing in the tree line long after dark, his figure still as a grave marker, his gaze locked on their cabins below. Chickens disappeared. A newborn lamb was found gutted. The rumors returned with force. The crows are feeding again. But this time no one would turn away. Armed men gathered, farmers, preachers, even outlaws, and one night they climbed the hillside together. They carried torches, axes, and rifles, their boots sinking into the mud as though the mountain itself tried to hold them back. When they reached the house, they found it shrouded in rot and stench, boards collapsing inward, windows blackened with grime. The matriarch stood in the doorway, her crooked frame silhouetted against the firelight. She raised her hands, not in surrender, but in defiance. The men didn't wait. The torches lit the dry timbers like kindling, and the Crow homestead burned. Screams echoed from within, some human, some not, and smoke curled into the night sky like a final offering. Silas charged through the flames, his face twisted in rage, but a shot from the ridge cut him down. The matriarch's voice carried even through the roar of the blaze. A curse spat into the air, a promise that the land would never forget. By dawn, nothing remained but ash, and yet, locals claimed the hillside never healed. No grass grew where the homestead had stood. Travelers reported hearing whispers in the trees, and hunters swore they saw shapes moving where no shapes should be. Some said the Crow blood had seeped into the soil, poisoning the mountain forever. Others whispered that a few family members escaped, that their descendants walk among us still, carrying the cruelty of their ancestors in secret. The legend of the Cruelest Appalachian family did not die in the fire. It scattered, like ashes in the wind, embedding itself into the folklore of the mountains. And to this day, those who dare to hike the old ridge after dark claim they hear it. The sound of footsteps in the underbrush, and a voice, raspy, hateful, eternal, whispering just beyond the treeline. The crows endure. E4.